Today we're going to be working on a 2002 Ford F-250 7.3 liter Powerstroke. We're going to be replacing the fuel filter housing assembly. We're going to show you a few tips and tricks on how to get the part out as easily as possible and in return put the new part back in as easily as possible. Just a quick note here, just so you'll know going into it, we have a total of 6 different connections on this fuel filter housing assembly that you're going to have to remove to get the part out. We have the pigtail connector on the back. We have the hose assembly in the back. On the side facing the passenger side of the vehicle, we have 2 different connections that are going to be coming off. And then on the side facing the driver's side, we also have 2 different connections that are going to have to come off of the old part so that we can get this new filter assembly in. And then of course, the 2 mounting bolts that are going to actually hold this part in place. So we'll get started. To access the 2 mounting bolts that are going to hold this fuel filter assembly in place, we're going to have to remove a few things, starting with the cover here. Now, in order to gain access to the bolts, we're going to have to remove also this coolant hose. And then off to the side of the coolant hose here, there's also the pressure feedback sensor. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be removed. However, if you pull that out, it's just a simple removal of a pigtail and then 1 sensor. You're actually going to have a lot more access to the bolts that hold this filter housing assembly in place. There's 2 that are right down behind this coolant hose, and that's truly the only thing mounting this on aside from the 6 connections we talked about in the beginning. So we'll do that. We'll get the hose off, we'll get the feedback sensor off, and then we can access the 2 bolts right here on the front. Now that we've removed the coolant hose and the feedback sensor, we do have access to these bolts, but we still want this filter assembly to be nice and tight while we're actually taking off these other 6 connections. So what we'll do from here, right here in the back, we'll go ahead and remove the pigtail from the back side of the filter housing. And again, we have our other 6 connections. We have the ones up here on the side, closer to the driver's side of the vehicle. We have the 2 on the other side of the filter housing assembly, a little bit lower down. We'll take those and remove those, and then we have the connection in the back. Once we have those 6 connections removed, we'll pull the 2 bolts that are sitting right up here, and this housing assembly will just pop right out. One other note that I need to make for you is on this coolant hose that we removed, you need to have a drip pan underneath the motor, because when you pull that off, you are going to have some antifreeze coolant spill out when you don't want to make a mess on your driveway or garage floor. And furthermore, you don't want to get that coolant all over your serpentine belt and other various components that are going to be in the way if it falls down. Now that we have our 6 connections removed and we have our 2 mounting bolts removed from the front, that allows us to take the filter housing assembly and pull it straight out of the top. Now, you will have a little bit of fuel spillage here. Again, just like with the antifreeze, make sure you have a drip pan underneath the vehicle. That way you don't make too much of a mess and you don't have to clean up a bunch of stains on the floor. Now that we have the housing assembly back in place, the first thing we're going to do is tighten back down on the bolts that are holding it in place, the mounting bolts. We want to do that so that this is very secure and very tight before we start putting on the other connections. Now that we have our housing assembly replaced, we have all of our lines reconnected, we have our mounting bolts reconnected, we have our pigtail reconnected, we're going to go ahead and put everything back on in a reverse order, including this coolant hose, which is already reattached. We're going to get our cover back on and our feedback sensor replaced. And then we're going to also go back and refill our coolant to make up for the amount of coolant that we lost in the process of removing this coolant hose. And hopefully now you have a better understanding of what it takes to replace the fuel filter housing assembly on a 2002 Ford F-250 7.3 liter Powerstroke.